Eva Eakins is a grassroots social justice advocate, a prevention educator, and mental health peer support specialist with lived experience who's working to raise awareness on human trafficking issues in the United States. Eva's focus is survivors who are children and young people, and they have worked for the county mental health care systems to identify at-risk youth and connect them with services. Welcome, Eva. Eva is joined by Charlee Borg, who you might know as Framework Senior Program Officer. The typical hat you see her wear is in developing, coordinating frameworks, trainings, and materials, but she's also a cross-cultural trauma psychologist by training, which you may not have known about her. She's supported survivors of trafficking through crisis and long-term counseling in individual and group settings, and has worked with survivors within and outside the US. She's conducted research on the impacts of trauma-sensitive yoga for survivors of gender-based violence and helped to build agency, county, and state-level anti-trafficking initiatives. Welcome to you both. We're so excited to have you, and I'm going to turn it over now to Charlee.
All right, thank you so much. So let's get started with our learning objectives for today. We are here to understand the trauma experienced by labor trafficking survivors, see the importance of naming those experiences properly, and gain some methods to help survivors move forward in their healing. So let's get straight to it. Perfect, thank you. So as you read this amazing Judith Herman quote, I want to remind you all a little bit about why we found this event to be so important. We want to increase awareness of what labor trafficking survivors go through and what should be considered when you're providing services. Anecdotally, I've seen that many labor trafficking organizations that I've provided technical assistance to are less familiar with trauma and gender-based violence. And in the anti-trafficking sphere, so many organizations also coming from the gender-based violence and sexual assault crisis rape crisis centers and intimate partner violence centers, organizations that tend to have some of that trauma and gender-based violence background, but not as much as the labor trafficking background. And I can speak from personal professional experience when I was working for an organization providing individual and group therapy, and I saw some of my first labor trafficking cases, and those individuals were coming in for services for experiencing sexual assault, but it was from their trafficker as they were being trafficked in a restaurant industry in Denver. I saw an individual who was seeing me for domestic violence and had a criminal record because their partner forced them to sell drugs on the side for family income. Something that if I was able to see for them, that could have potentially impacted their criminal conviction. So these things are really important. Being able to identify experiences can change the lives of the survivors that we work with in all settings. We also know that across the country, a survey found that Americans believe sex trafficking is a larger problem, that labor trafficking only happens to foreign nationals. This is something that we also want to dispel a little bit. I know that a lot of you are probably coming in with this information already, but this is paralleled in our systems. It's paralleled in how many organizations offer labor trafficking services and provide screenings to identify. It's paralleled in the fact that in 2012, there were 567 arrests for sex trafficking offenses and 24 for labor trafficking. This has largely increased, and we are seeing a decrease in the disparities between the types of human trafficking, but the hierarchy in the field created by misconceptions contributes to disparities in client care and who is able to access shelters, long-term services, and resources to help them navigate their trauma. So let's talk about how we can move forward together today. You can go to the next slide. Before we get started, I do want to give a quick content warning. In seeing and validating labor trafficking survivors' experiences of exploitation, of crime, of abuse, we are going to be talking about those things today. So at any moment, I encourage you to take the space that you need, take a break, reach out to Framework in the chat if we can support you in any way. So you've heard a little bit about my experiences, my learning, my growing as a professional. Let's go to the next slide and hear a video from another professional who has...
Hi, I'm Amy Fleischauer, the Director of Survivor Support Services at the International Institute of Buffalo. We currently serve about 350 survivors of trafficking each year. About 25% of the survivors we serve are considered survivors of labor trafficking. The very first case that we worked on within our program was involved several survivors that were recovered from a massage parlor. At the time, because that industry was part of the sex industry, we only categorized that case as a sex trafficking case. Now looking back, what I understand is that those survivors that were trafficked within the massage parlor were actually victimized both within the sex industry, but also their labor. They were required as part of their exploitation to clean, to take calls, to set up appointments, and do other work within the business that is categorized as labor trafficking. It's important that people who are exploited and experience violence are able to name all of those types of exploitation. We know that survivors' ability to name what happened to them, to have that affirmed by a service provider or law enforcement, will help them move forward more quickly in their healing.
All right, so let's talk about some of the experiences of trauma that are common for survivors of labor trafficking. Some of these experiences might fit into preconceived notions, such as dangerous work environments and legal insecurities, but at the end of the day, traffickers are traffickers and will use any means necessary to create fear, to manipulate, to control victims. These types of experiences include physical violence, such as withholding medical treatment, physical harm, hitting, pushing, sleep and food deprivation, exhausting work hours, and torture. In one report, survivors were given 2 meals a day of only noodles for 16 months with no access to medical care or nutritional provisions in any other way. This not only has an incredible impact on individuals' physical health, but we also know that this impacts our brain. It literally deteriorates gray matter and decreases prefrontal cortex functioning, which is useful in things like regulating sleep, in controlling emotions, in being able to be a happy, healthy, functioning adult or person. Another instance that was described in this report is that one survivor was forced to stand in one place without moving for 10 hours as a punishment for taking 2 pieces of chocolate when they were hungry. Sexual abuse is also commonly seen. In one report in 2017 of 240 US citizens of labor trafficking survivors, it was found that 1/3 of survivors experienced sexual abuse. The most common reports were in the restaurant and construction industries, but sexual abuse and assault and harassment were common across all. This was also disproportionately something that individuals with different sexual orientations than cisgender heteronormative groups focused. Emotional abuse, as you can imagine, is also incredibly common. One person shared that their traffickers would berate them, would yell racial slurs, would do this in front of other people, like the neighbors of the home that they lived and worked at in a domestic servitude situation. Once this was for something as little as just wasting a paper towel. Another survivor said that traffickers would brag about going hunting for the individuals who left, just to continue this, this force and coercion of the individuals who were remaining there. Legal insecurity, forced illegal activities, sabotage of working and living statuses, which is a common trafficker method of control, were something that was seen and reported. Deception and misinformation regarding individuals' rights in the United States and control of documents were all things that were common. Let's move to the next slide and discuss a couple more experiences, such as dangerous work conditions. On the right here, you will see actual pictures taken from a worker's living quarters. This is in Colorado. This was for a group of individuals that were being trafficked in the herding industry in rural Colorado. You can see that the living situation is not somewhere that feels safe, is up to code. The door is held on with tape. We have the toilet, if you can call it that was dug by the survivors. They had no access to electricity, to heat, to running water, to clean drinking water, or to toilets. 16% of survivors overall that report labor trafficking experiences say that they experience hazardous work conditions and poor access to protective equipment, up to code workspaces, things like sunlight, windows, and the outdoors. Other things too that not only deteriorate our physical health, but our mental health as well. And through these things, through exposure to chemicals, to bacteria, to physical dangers, a lot of survivors also took away from their trafficking experience long-term pain, health conditions, and physical disabilities. Marginalization, racism, and prejudice, all things that were also very commonly experienced and used against survivors. Eva's going to talk a little bit more about that next. Isolation, which I think is something that we're really familiar with in the human trafficking sphere, and financial abuse, which looks similar to other survivors that you've worked with, but also include hiring and work fees that cause financial instability and create that dependence. All of these things cause incredible stress. Survivors had high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidality, dissociative disorders, decreased self-efficacy, their belief in their ability to do something, to take on something, to count on that voice inside of themselves, letting them know if something is right or wrong. All things that impacted these survivors in the long run. Now I'm going to hand it off to Eva so that they can talk with you a little bit more about marginalization.
Thank you, Charlie. Next slide, please. Here is a list of some social identity that lead to marginalization from the society. Individuals with any of these identifications make them more vulnerable for targeted abuse and exploitations. Traffickers take advantage of their general lack of social support and lack of protection from the authorities. Next, please. According to vocabulary.com, the word marginalized is described as follows. When you push people to the edge of society by not allowing them a place within it, you marginalize them. A society that labels certain people as outside of the norm, weird, scary, hateful, or useless, marginalizes those people, edging them out. Next, please. This is a diagram to help us better visualize the idea of marginalization in our society. Those with the most privileges are located at the center circle, and the more marginalized the person is, the greater the distance from the center circle becomes. In general, our society is set up systematically to benefit people in the inner circles and people from the outer margins to serve them. Marginalized persons, such as labor trafficking survivors, are made to move across the layers of socioeconomic barriers to service those in the inner circles. However, people from the inner circles rarely travel out to offer protections or assistance for those who are in the outer margins. What happens when someone has overlapping marginalized identities? For example, trafficked, female, and minor. Would she be welcomed into many circles of people or edged out? Black, male, and gay. Would he be more likely to be welcomed or be edged out? One person whose voice has more influence can set the tone for the entire group as well. Oh no, we are not friends. Our organization has nothing to do with this person. Where would you imagine yourself to be located in these concentric circles? Next, please. How about some survivors? What are we able to see or not see based on our location in the society and our own life experiences? The aim of this exercise is to start thinking about the impacts of marginalization on labor trafficking survivors in a more concrete way. Where would you position the 35-year-old Hispanic man with accent in his speech picking fruits in the field? How about a 60-year-old Black woman who works as a janitor? Would these people have any difference accessing services from a white English-speaking 20-year-old? What preconceived notions and ideas do you think is contributing certain persons to be overlooked and considered as the potential survivors of labor trafficking? Back to you, Charlee.
Thank you, Eva. All right, now that we have a better understanding about the context that survivors are coming to us with, let's get back a little bit more about the experiences while in the labor trafficking moments. First, I want to talk about minors. I think that minors and US citizens are two groups that we think of a little bit less often when we're thinking of labor trafficking, but our research today includes a lot of studies that focus specifically on minors, specifically on adults, specifically on US citizens, specifically on foreign nationals. And following this event, you'll get all of those resources. So if you're not collecting them in the chat right now, don't worry about it. 2018 study, Psychological Consequences of Child Trafficking, reported that researchers found 41% of the individuals participating in the study reported experiencing sex trafficking, 33 labor trafficking, and 26, they either didn't specify or they didn't collect that data. 11% of this cohort were male, the majority were female, 53% of whom were living in foster care. Though 25% of the minors' reports, again, were not collected, of the individuals who did share, 73 reported that they experienced abuse during their trafficking experience. 53 experienced physical violence, 49% stated that they experienced sexual violence, and 22% met Western criteria for affective disorders, 22% for post-traumatic stress disorder, and 19% for other childhood emotional disorders, with 27% of the individuals reporting that they had attempted suicide at some moment in time. I want to talk about trauma bonding for a second as well. Trauma bonding, again, I imagine that this is something you're all familiar with. If you don't feel as confident in your understanding of trauma, psychological impact, trauma bonding, we will be sharing those resources again at the during the follow-up of this event. But trauma bonding happens in labor trafficking experiences. It happens similarly through familial, through romantic relationships, through friendships, through chosen family for individuals who are experiencing houselessness. Let's go to the next slide and hear from a survivor as he shares about his experiences of trauma bonding.
As a survivor of child labor trafficking who experienced trafficking through the use of a traumatic bond, through child sex abuse, through that grooming process, I was robbed of my childhood, and I didn't really get a chance to experience many of the things that my peers were experiencing at a very pivotal age, between the ages of 13 and 16. That loss of innocence is, for me, why this issue is so important and why people really need to pay attention to how kids can end up on the spectrum of exploitation, where it's not just, sex trafficking over here, labor trafficking over here, but rather recognize that anytime you have vulnerable children, children from backgrounds where they have experienced early childhood trauma, like was the case in my case, kids of color, like I was, where you can have these experiences where kids can end up being abused and exploited by older adults, where they can develop a traumatic bond and then end up in these situations where they live with other people, and they're willing to do anything for their trafficker or abuser, including domestic servitude, work, babysitting, household chores, working in certain industries, as a way to, essentially espouse, their belief in their love for the person.
All right, we can go. I hope that video helps you to all remember that behind each of these statistics are groups of people. Each data point is a person, and it's important to remember that at the end of the day. Also, that video on trauma bonding is available at our resource library at frameworkta.org. All of our resources are free, and we encourage you to use those in your partner trainings. I also know that even though I wanted to give you all of these statistics today, because these numbers, they can be helpful in these partner trainings, in grant proposals and things like that. Statistics should always be taken with a grain of salt. Research should always be taken with a grain of salt. As I said, we are mixing US citizen data, foreign national data, adult, minors, all of that to try and give you a whole picture. But one research study isn't able to do that. And we are talking in Western terms as far as diagnoses and as far as trauma expression. And that in some cases can mean that individuals are missed out or not necessarily seen. So just a quick reminder. That being said, in another study, 59% of adult labor trafficking survivors met Western criteria for depression, PTSD, or both. And these impacts were seen through changes in their relationships, familial, friendship, romantic, etc., self-regulation, impulsivity, attention, perception of self and the world, and somatic experiences, what was going on in their bodies. These are all things that make it hard for clients to connect with us, for clients to connect with themselves and the resources and the areas around them, for them to make friendships, for them to go back to work while acknowledging that they might experience microaggressions, which Eva's going to talk with you about, that they experienced that remind them of their racism during their trafficking moment. So all of these things are important to consider when you're working with clients. A lot of survivors experienced deprivation, threats, or use of violence, demoralization, intimidation, and control. 70% were threatened with law enforcement, and unfortunately, in 19% of the cases, victims were removed of, fortunately, in 19% of the cases, victims were removed from trafficking situations when they did report abuse to law enforcement. Unfortunately, 14% of the time, almost just as often, victims were arrested by police after making reports of abuse, most often due to their immigration status. Another important reason that we're continuing to build up these partnerships and share this information with others, to share too and prepare our partners, police officers, medical providers, substance use providers, gender-based violence organization, legal remedy institutions, all on what might be going on for the client. In the Urban Institute document, there's information about some differences of abuse trends across industries. But what we really want you to take away from today is that labor trafficking survivors are experiencing trauma, and not always necessarily in the way that we stereotypically think of it. They're experiencing emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and they are receiving services at all of those local agencies that are available for you to partner with. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for your organization, for the local health clinic, when individuals go to treat their bruises and their burns, when individuals connect to rape crisis centers at hospitals because they are experiencing violence from their traffickers, from other employees, or other individuals who are also being trafficked. All of these are great opportunities to connect with clients, to let them know that their experiences are important and that they have resources and opportunities to change their lives with your help. So I encourage you to think about what you can do in your organization and how you can impede the trauma that survivors are experiencing on a regular basis, and how you can do more to potentially connect and serve with those individuals. Let's move to the next slide. A quote, a beautiful, amazing quote that I bet a lot of you are familiar with, loosely based on the prolific psychologist Viktor Frankl's writing. Viktor Frankl, who is a concentration camp, and depending on how you think of it, labor trafficking survivor, that reminds us that every reaction to an abnormal event is a normal reaction. And I also do want to give a quick caveat that unless specified, it is important that your organization is not screening without service, that if you are working with clients to understand their trauma experiences, that you're connecting them to resources so that they are able to learn more, to gain that psychoeducation, etc. Because it isn't important to drudge up these experiences to get the details, any of that, unless it's important to that survivor to share that with you for some reason, and otherwise to connect with the relevant opportunities. All of these trauma impacts may be seen by the survivors in their everyday life, and they might feel like they're anxious, like they're crazy, like they're bad, they're incapable. It can be tiring and frustrating for clients and for providers sometimes when things are difficult with attending appointments on time, with following up. There might be avoidance, there might be fear, there might be cultural things that the survivor doesn't want to let you down and has kind of a perfectionistic viewpoint. So all things to consider, and we're going to talk a little bit about how survivors might see themselves as well. But all of those are opportunities. So let's look at what trauma looks like. Things, again, that I know that you're familiar with. Trauma looks like shame and guilt, mistrust of others, body aches, dissociation from ourselves, from our bodies, from what's going on, memory differences, changes in appetite and sleep, anger and irritability, particularly seen in minors and males identified individuals. Distraction or doing too much, again, that perfectionistic piece is something that not all providers think of. They might even be like, this individual, they have it down. They are already learning the bus system. They already have a new job. They're already in school. They're sending money to their loved ones, they're providing for their family, whatever it might look like, it's a good thing to check in with that individual and to also provide them a psychoeducation about what might be going on, where all of that drive might be coming from. Not saying that it's always a bad place. And honestly, all of these experiences and trauma expressions are typically a way for our body and our brains to protect us. So on the next slide, we can see a little bit about what trauma sounds like. Feelings like, this is my only option. I need to try harder. I need to do more. I'm worthless. I can't do anything right. I can't succeed. Feeling like you can't, like survivors can't trust themselves, or that they're better just going it alone because they can't trust others. All experiences that are common. Let's go to the next slide and talk about some opportunities to decrease re-traumatization. We can go to the next slide. One more back. Perfect, thank you. All right, so opportunities that you have to decrease re-traumatization. Empowering and validating experiences that survivors are going through, typically really through that psychoeducation, explaining why symptoms might be arising, where they're coming from, where their body and their brain is protecting them, and what opportunities they might have to move through that. Eva's going to talk through some of those opportunities later. Seeking to increase identification in your area, in your organization, across every single department. This is something that we can do. We can make it so that there is a move from the reality that most labor trafficking survivors self-identify their experience and reach out to resources independently, versus sex trafficking survivors who are most often referred to resources and organizations after their experience has been identified for them. Making sure that labor trafficking survivors know that they're not alone in this. Decreasing separation of trafficking, increasing access to resources, to the opportunities you have at your organization, and increasing those partnerships. If your organization has only worked with US citizens so far, it might be a new learning curve to learn about how to connect foreign nationals with benefits, about how to access legal remedy services. Encourage staff to learn about their biases and be insightful and introspective in themselves and their own processes. It also might be important when you have staffing clients who have a lot of similarities in their background and their experiences in kind of their 200-year concept of being a person in the United States. It can be triggering. It can cause parallel process and secondary or vicarious trauma. Also, offering resources at your organization for those staff members, for all staff members. And also, I want to share about the importance of using culturally appropriate tools, and just in general, being curious with clients who come from different backgrounds as you, no matter what that might be, whether or not it is in regard to ethnicity, race, language, country of origin, gender identity. There are a lot of opportunities to connect with individuals who are different than us, and being curious, being humble is always a good place to start with that. Barriers to service based on trafficking type, language, gender identity, possession of identification. These are all things that are hurdles that we want to join in with our organization and with these trafficking survivors, making sure that individuals who are in the midst of their trauma are not being mistreated in systems and are not going at it alone. All right, I'm going to go to Last quote by, again, Judith Herman. I can't help it. Just on the next slide, Tanisha. By helping survivors to identify their experiences of labor trafficking, we help to open doors to resources and understanding. By validating that this individual experienced a crime, we are saying we refuse to be bystanders in this crime. We offer to share the burden, take action, engage with their journey, and remember that their experience is important. Overall, helping survivors see themselves is an act of revolution against traffickers. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am that all of you are here today to be a part of this revolution. Right now, I'm going to hand it off to Eva, but I appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Tanisha, for the technical assistance for today. Next slide, please. So in this section, I'd like to delve into the interpersonal nature of labor trafficking trauma. What is interpersonal trauma? Dr. Robert J. Lifton is a professor of psychiatry and an expert on the topic of interpersonal violence. He describes the interpersonal trauma as a break in the human lifeline. Interpersonal violence is committed by a person or persons against another human being. Abused, neglected, and abandoned children suffer from interpersonal trauma. Rape, historical trauma, war crimes, and human trafficking are all examples of trauma that is an interpersonal nature. As a labor trafficking survivor myself, it was essential for my healing that the interpersonal nature of trauma was explored and made clear to me. I never heard of such a thing as an interpersonal trauma before, and I didn't consider myself as traumatized. I really needed some psychoeducation on this. The nature of interpersonal trauma is often hidden and implicit, but it is something that is everyday experience of survivors. Let's explore the possibility of making the cultural change in our service that can make it possible to have a conversation that acknowledges the nature of interpersonal trauma. In the next slide, I invite you to a short thought experiment. Next, please. What do you see? Can you see a black circle as anything other than what it is? Next, please. Now, what do you see in a rat? When we see an object like a black circle, it is difficult for most people to see things other than what it is. On the other hand, when we see an animal or a person, what we tend to see is the associations and biases that already exist in our culture. And we do this unconsciously, unaware that we are even doing it. What impact does this have on survivors? Next, please. We all know early social interactions have significant impact on a person's development, sense of safety, personal, and social identity. Labor trafficking survivors often carry the consequences of marginalization. The stereotypical labels, social identities, and biases are all intertwined and then interrelated in survivors' life to be victimized. Any of the negative characterizations that society casts onto them are not who survivors truly are, but often survivors unconsciously pick them up and internalize them as they are who they are. In a way, both the service providers and survivors are all swimming against the complex stream of our culture, swimming against biased messages, stream of the time we live in, even our own internalized personal experiences. Next, let's talk about microaggressions. Microaggressions are minor, seemingly innocuous statements, subtle behaviors, and attitudes that are actually stereotype reinforcing trauma, even if the person making the statement meant nothing negative. The neuroscience of emotional pain tells us that emotional shuffling has the same impact on the brain as physical pain. Exactly the same regions of the brains are activated when people experience physical pain and social rejections. Another research study published in the Journal of Social Action in Counseling and Psychology informs us that greater PTSD symptoms are associated with microaggressions. The study says in part, when individuals are diagnosed with PTSD, trauma specialists traditionally attribute the negative symptoms that an individual is facing to an external source, instead of some weakness or fault of the individual. By not naming racism or other forms of oppression as a legitimate type of trauma, people of color and other marginalized groups of individuals continue to internalize that they are not coping with discrimination effectively, instead of externalizing the role of the historical and systemic oppression in their lives. I'd like to point out that, like, someone does not have to be a misogynist to commit a rape. A person does not have to be a transphobia, xenophobic, or racist to commit microaggressions. This is all about unconscious biases we all have unwittingly picked up just by living in our culture. We all have the potential to commit the transgression. The way society is organized and function is mostly out of our control. It's not our fault. None of us asked for it. However, we don't have to be a passive recipient of social conditioning. We don't have to be ignorant or uninformed about it. In that, we have a choice, and from it comes the freedom. Next slide, please. I created this piece while I was working through my trauma experiences. Social shunning is constant in labor trafficking survivors' life, both from the society and from the perpetrators. People don't realize how much of what's in their heart can come out in their attitude. You don't have to speak English to receive the energy in this room. It is felt on a visceral level. This is what the interpersonal trauma looks like. This is what labor trafficking survivors are experiencing, and still being minimized and told that it isn't happening. And this is what needs to be named, acknowledged, and understood for survivors to start their healing. So what is the solution? Next slide, please. I'd like to open this section by this poem. When young, it was the fall from love. It broke me open the way lightning splits a tree. Then years later, cancer broke me further. This time, it broke me wider the way a flood curbs the banks of a narrow stream. Then, having to leave a 20-year marriage. This broke me the way wind shatters glass. Then in Africa, it was the anonymous face of a schoolboy beginning his life. This broke me yet again, but this was like hot water melting soap. Each time, I tried to close what had been opened. It was a reflex, natural enough. But the lesson was, of course, the other way, in never closing again. Let's explore how self-compassion plays a huge role in protecting yourself and helping others, and healing and restorative to the survivors. Mindful self-compassion is a skill to apply kind awareness, emphasis on kind. What are benefits of self-compassion practice? For survivors, it promotes healing of core shame and complex PTSD. It prevents re-traumatization. It supports the grieving process of loss, foster post-traumatic growth. It cultivates feeling of connectedness, and it creates resilience in navigating difficulties in life in general. And for service providers, it prevents vicarious trauma, also prevents burnout and compassion fatigue. And it even allows providing service to be a source of gratification, not the source of stress. So why self-compassion? Have you noticed that implicit biases we carry are never about the other person? Rather, it is about the walls we unintentionally created in our hearts. The labor trafficking survivors don't have any control over what's in our heart. It's up to each one of us and our responsibility to take down the walls. What about the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings and the value statements in the organizations? In my personal experience, I can be fully present in a training and not available at all because my heart is closed. The question to ask instead is, how do we know we are aligned to the values and being accountable? The reason developing self-compassion skills is the prerequisite is because it is a practice to promote acceptance of other human beings as just like ourselves. The more we know how to be compassionate for ourselves and have experience with coping hard times with kindness in a balanced way, the better we'll be able to extend the same to people outside of our circles. The values we align ourselves with, together with self-compassion, is just the practice we need to be accountable. We are co-creating the culture we live in every day by just living it. We can become conscious change makers by starting treating ourselves with more kindness. I'd like to tell you a story about how self-compassion practice supported my own healing journey. I was born as a slave in Japan. I lost 26 years of my life through exploitations, and I spent the next 10 trying to claim my life as my own for the first time. In Japan, we eat eggs raw, like the picture shown here. When I was a child, everyone in the community knew my predicament, but it was an accepted reality. Just like here in the United States, there is an accepted reality that some foreigners are trafficked on farms. When I was 5 or 6, I remember being really, really tired and sitting at the curbside of a fish market. An old lady comes by and invited me into her home. I was terrified because no one was good or nice to me ever to that point of my life. My experiences were that adults were only there to hurt or use me. I didn't feel like I had a choice when she told me to come with her. So we went to her tiny apartment. She goes into the kitchen and makes 2 bowls of rice and opens her refrigerator. It was empty, except some eggs and some soy sauce bottle. She added the eggs to the rice and we ate together. After finished eating, she took me back to where I was sitting and said, "You can always come back. I don't have a lot, but I always try to keep some rice and eggs. This was the first person in my life ever to treat me like I was a real child deserving of care. What she had done was very modest. She didn't try to save me or do anything heroic. She was comfortable just to be with me, and my predicament didn't scare her away. The memory of this old lady became my anchor in my healing process later in my life when I finally freed myself. Until I started to practice self-compassion though, I would make progress, but then I would inevitably implode with build-up stress and pressure in life. Self-compassion is the counterbalance to trauma and stress. When I could remember and turn into the felt sense kindness, even though the old lady isn't there with me, the memory of it was enough to hold me up emotionally. It took me 30 years to come to understand her compassion. Next, please. What I want you to know is this: never, ever be afraid to do what is kind and good, just because you're not sure about the outcome in the future for the survivor. You can never be wrong or hurt someone because you are compassionate and kind. Another thing is, you never know what impact you will leave on survivor's heart. You may not see the result right away. For me, it took 30 years. But you are making the difference. So I invite you to seriously consider basing your work on values instead of task-oriented results. If we base our effectiveness on resulting, I'm sorry, still the previous slide, please. If we base our effectiveness on resulting, we can get burnt out. Or you might start internalizing each outcome, such as, I'm not cut out for this. I must not be doing enough. It's not personal. But if you'd like to try basing your work on a value, you must decide for yourself what values are important to align yourself with and how you can carry them out in your work. For me, I align myself with non-harming and compassion. Is it harmful or not harmful? Is this compassionate or not compassionate? In this way, you don't get disappointed when things don't come to fruition in your work with survivors. The result will come in due time anyway. I hope this made sense. I'm sorry for the sudden stop. So for right now, please acknowledge to yourself right now, you are making a difference in the survivors' lives you are serving. Next slide, please. So did you do it? When I invited you to acknowledge the positive difference you are making for survivors' life, did you fully accept it in your heart with affirming thoughts to yourself? If you didn't, what happened? Did you experience some resistance to do so? What did you say to yourself? Judging, fixing, and comparing thoughts are the usual suspects. These thoughts we have about ourselves are subtle forms of aggressions towards ourselves. They block our innate self-compassion. When we judge ourselves, we are strengthening the neural pathway of judging in our brains. the negativity bias is already hardwired in our biology. What counterbalances with our negativity bias is the self-compassion practice. And this takes awareness and deliberate attention to cultivate it, because the self-awareness practice is a higher brain function in the medial prefrontal cortex. When we want to strengthen our muscles, we need to exercise on a regular basis. The same is true with the self-compassion. Mindful self-compassion practice changes our brain structure. MRI scans show the structural change in as little as 14 days of daily mindfulness practice. Next slide, please. So right now, I invite you to participate in a short meditation practice. What I'd like for you to do is, first, to keep your eyes open. Now I invite you to look away from the screen of your device and send your attention to the far corner of your room you are sitting. Now bring your attention towards the ceiling. Next, I invite you to examine your fingernails very, very closely. And back to the screen. Wherever you are and whatever you do, you can determine where attention goes. You can also sustain the awareness of your mind as a participant observer as it happens. This is sati, S-A-T-I, mindfulness. Now, I invite you to gently close your eyes if you're comfortable. And please bring to your mind a friend, a family member who has the best interest in you, kind and caring towards you. This could be also a pet, religious figures, can even be a compassionate character from a movie or a book. Now, please really, really sense into the heartfelt quality of being with this special being. While sustaining this heartfelt sense alive, gradually let go of the image of this being. Keep your attention on just the felt sense. I invite you to really immerse yourself in this wholesomeness. Now I invite you to send so much of this wholesomeness to your judging mind, fixing mind, and comparing mind. So much compassion for yourself. This is not a mistake. It is just the way it is. We all grapple with this. Hold it gently with much compassion. When you are ready, I invite you to gently come back to the room and please open your eyes. Thank you for your practice. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. The primary mode of practice is the meditation, but this may not be the first one to introduce to a client, especially when someone is still in an active trafficking situation or diagnosed with PTSD. There are other ancillary modes of practice that are studied to be very effective. Keeping a gratitude diary is highly recommended. It is short and very easy to incorporate in our busy lives. What you'll do is to write down 5 small things from the day that you are grateful for. This only takes 3 to 5 minutes of your time. Next slide, please. Yeah. In the next section, I'd like to briefly talk about peer support specialists. Next, please. So peer support specialists are persons with a lived experience with significant life-altering events, such as labor trafficking, who are trained to empower others going through similar circumstances. They are almost always employed at the public mental health sectors. Next slide, please. I am trained as a peer support specialist. This means I am uniquely authorized to share my personal experiences with clients. What I like about it is when I first share that I am a peer, more often than not, eyes of clients light up as if to say, wow, I can't believe someone like me can have a job like yours. And working as a peer support specialist can offer meaning and purpose to what happened to the survivors. It adds dignity to the human trafficking and labor trafficking experiences and as a human being. Labor trafficking survivors lack a community support where they are seen in a good light. I think it is a good idea to create a space where a group of survivors who share their experience, because that takes a person to a certain place where you thought you were alone in the suffering and it was difficult and depressing. And now you find other people who had felt the same way and everyone feels supported. There is an assumption that you come from somewhere and belong to a community or family. That's not always how survivors feel, and they struggle to find healing because the social integration doesn't happen for varieties of factors and reasons. The last stage in trauma healing in a tripartite model is the integration into a larger community and sense of belonging to the humanity. A support group doesn't have to be a group therapy. It could be a one that creates healing art together. It could be self-compassion practice community. And it could even be a hiking club. These can all facilitated by peer support specialists. Next slide, please. Lastly, here are some recommendations to start incorporating some of what we have talked about in today's presentation. And before I hand my mic over for Q&A, I have one last word. If my unskillful ways of presenting any materials today caused you any difficult feelings, I ask for your forgiveness. And I very much welcome any constructive feedbacks you might have so I can learn to be better next. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eva. And Charlee, I think I saw a lot of gratitude coming through in the chat, some appreciation, lots of claps and snaps and hearts for everything that you were sharing. And I know as folks are gathering their thoughts and questions to include in the Q&A, I just want to reflect, I know I was part of the run through of this presentation, and even having been part of it this second time, I have a lot of notes for myself and a lot of thoughts that came up. So I know folks are experiencing a similar thing. While folks are gathering themselves, I want to just put a link to our satisfaction survey in the chat. Please let us know what you thought of the training. Your thoughts and feedback will come to Framework to inform future events, as well as to our presenters to let them know what they did and really resonated with you. So please take a second to fill that out. And I'm going to get right to the first question here. And again, folks, please keep these questions and thoughts coming. I know you have a lot sort of that you're trying to digest. And I love this first question because in it is sort of an observation as well, that as you spoke, Eva, about helping survivors to practice self-compassion themselves, this question is about how can being self-compassionate as workers, as professionals, make us better providers?
I'm sorry, I was just spacing out. Would you repeat the question for me?
Of course. So the question is about how can being self-compassionate make us better providers?
Well, the self-compassion practice, when we know how to be kind to ourselves first and know how to go through difficult times in a compassionate and kind and balanced way, it is natural that we can extend that because that's your natural mode of carrying yourself and going about your life. And so you can naturally extend that to the clients that we serve. I hope this answers your question.
I think that's a great reflection, the power of just modeling and the power of being able to set the tone in an interaction based on how we sort of treat and respect ourselves and treat ourselves with grace, that can be modeled for the people that we're working with.
Eva, you know, it's kind of ironic that I'm just realizing in this moment is that we always tell providers that they have to be like willing to do the work and go through the things that we ask our clients to go through. And honestly, I think that when I hear that, I receive that as like, oh, I got to be willing to go through the hard work. I got to be able to like process my experiences and move through my personal trauma and like work with a therapist, like work with whoever on my somatic experiences. And I don't even think about like, it means that you have to also be willing and be interested and be dedicated and know that you're worth going through all the positive things, like gaining all of those incredible self-resourcing tools for yourself, which are a part of all that difficult work. But it's just funny. That's just maybe the way that I received that historically, but I'm just noticing that now.
Thanks, Charlee. There's another great question in here, and it's sort of echoes something that came up for me so much as you were talking about that sort of tendency to get into that task-focused, task-oriented mindset when it comes to service delivery, because there are so many concrete needs that we feel really compelled to focus on and can really stress us out and weigh us down because we always feel like we're falling short because the systems are so broken and there are so many barriers. And so this question is about really how to prioritize moving into that values mindset and thinking about the engagement and prioritizing addressing the trauma component within the relationship and the experience more broadly of the survivor. And so the question is, what should I do if my client has a lot of trauma, but they say, I'm fine, and they only want help with their concrete needs, the legal stuff or the housing or any other examples?
I would say that, listen and let your clients lead you. And like I shared, when a person comes from an open heart, you can never do wrong, even if when the answer is no. What I mean is, there was another experience that I had, I contemplated to share and didn't share today for the time reasons. There was a time when I was facing like life-threatening danger. Really, it was dangerous. I was, everybody thought I was most certainly going to die. And there were a couple of people who tried to save me, really tried to meet my needs. And it didn't come through. So, the outcome didn't come to fruition despite the helpers. I don't hold any grudges when things things fell short and didn't come through. I needed the concrete help, right? Because I was going to die. I appreciated that because, think about it. What if I had no one, like no one even tried to do anything about it because it wasn't going to work out anyway. So why bother? Why waste the time and resources and, help you? And the value-based approach and the concrete way of helping, if you are interested, there are strategists who work professionally to provide coaching and support in the long run. And I didn't list that in the resources, but if people are interested, I think I can add that, and then maybe the framework, someone in the framework can forward that information. I hope this answered the question.
Beautifully. I want to toss it to Charlee as well, if you have thoughts on how to broach this conversation with clients.
I do. I think, again, starting with the clients at and just be curious. I think that that this is something that we see for a multitude of reasons. Perhaps the individual just really has other priorities. Being curious about how you can about what those priorities are and how you can support them, or that your agency can support them. Thinking outside of the box. This is incredibly important when we're thinking of not only going for restricted funds that are allocated across boxes through typical grant funding streams, but also using community partners, businesses, whoever you have in your area who might be willing to offer unrestricted funds, so that when your client cannot focus on their healing, cannot slow down from 100 miles an hour every single day, working 3 jobs, working and going to school, whatever it might be, because they have to make sure that they're paying rent, because they have to make sure that they're paying for school fees for relatives in other countries, whatever it might be. That's where we should be curious about how else we can resource people. But the other thing that I will say is that frequently it comes down to psychoeducation, and I talk about other clients kind of ambiguously a lot when I'm working with individuals. This might not apply to you, but other clients find this to be helpful. Empowering them however you can by offering resources that might be relevant to them, and that if you see that this individual is struggling, maybe they are going forward and meeting all of those needs, but they're often angry, or they're often tearful, they're often overwhelmed, whatever it might be, because they're just not paying attention or having space for themselves. Ask them what they are able to do when they're driving to work, how they can listen to music or listen to meditations when they're on the bus, when they're walking somewhere, how they can be mindful and pay attention to the surrounding area, the leaves in the trees, the bark on the branches, whatever it might be. There's a lot of opportunity in just our day-to-day, and clients might be utilizing things already. They might be kind of pattern movement people. They might talk to friends and family often, just even acknowledging that. It makes me think of this study that's kind of unrelated, where they had ironically maids in a hotel system think about how much they exercised a day, and they said, I don't exercise at all. you know, probably like an hour worth of walking. And then they threw a pedometer on them and they're like, you walk 8 miles every single day. And it actually changed their mindset and had a physiological impact. And that could be seen through medical testing. So I think that even just helping clients acknowledge what they are doing in the moments available to them can be helpful. And then modeling through your own behavior, but also through the kind of hypothetical other clients were experiencing this, had these priorities, had these responsibilities, and had this stress. And this is how they thought that it was, worthwhile to make an hour of their Wednesday so that they could go to peer support lunch or groups or whatever it is in your area.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate those very practical responses. I always think about like, okay, well, what words do I say in these settings? As folks keep their questions coming, I really encourage you to take advantage of the expertise that we have at our disposal this afternoon. I want to toss another question out as I'm just reflecting back to my direct service days where I got some not perfect advice when I first started out as a case manager to be sort of wary of opening the door to talking about or addressing or acknowledging trauma in any way, because I'm not a clinician, and that it can be really harmful and dangerous for the people that I'm working with and for myself to present myself in a way that makes it seem like I'm a resource that a clinician could to provide the same kind of support that a clinician could provide. So I'm wondering what your advice is for folks who might be hesitant to address trauma in their non-clinical role. How do you define sort of the barrier between compassionate, values-based support and the role of a more formally trained clinical worker? How do we balance that, and how do we build up our confidence to sort of address this in a way that's responsible?
Eva, do you want to go first?
It's the question about when some survivors are seeking, like actively looking for to go into the trauma therapy, or are they just wanting support, like a friend? Like, I would get a call from a friend that they are in a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not calling me because I work for the behavioral health department in the county. He or she or my friend, they are calling me because they want emotional support, not be a therapist. They're not asking me to fix them, just want the support. So I think you need to determine for yourself if is this person trying to find someone that can fix them, or are they asking for just support as a person to person? I think that can inform you for what needs to do.
Yeah, and I'm thinking in particular, just to add some clarity of, I always found it easier when clients were engaged in therapy or in counseling, because then it would help distinguish and encourage them to say, wow, like this is really something that could be explored in that space much more deeply. But here, let me validate what you've just said. Let me make sure you feel seen and heard, having expressed that to me. And so knowing that there's another place that they can explore that more deeply helps. But so often, in my experience, former clients didn't engage in counseling for a variety of reasons. And they had so few relationships at the time that they were engaged in services. So there was me and there was their attorney. And so they were coming to us with a lot of the stuff that was just on their mind and sort of weighing on their hearts. And so I think that's where that advice came from, of like, be careful with boundaries, right? Like, don't invite too much of that in, because for one, you really can't provide the kind of support, the level, the depth, right, of support that they need. And then also, just from a practical standpoint, you've got a large caseload. You can't spend 2 hours a day on the phone with a person, even if that is really what they need and deserve. And so that it's not really a clear question. It's just coming up for me as a challenge, and just want to invite you both to sort of reflect on that. Any advice you'd have?
In that case, I would invite this person to find a mindful self-compassion practice group that's available for free most of the time. And clearly this person feels some connection with you. That's why this person is coming to you. And one of the benefits that self-compassion meditation practice will bring is that you don't have to be there for her, or, you know, I thought that it's her person. And like my example, the old lady who gave me the rice and egg, she's no longer with us, but I still feel the compassion that I felt from her because I do practice, and I can evoke that support anytime I like and carry it with me. Mm. And trauma survivors, you know, not just labor trafficking survivors, carry a sense of separation from the world, and no one can fill that void in their heart. But the self-compassion practice can bring more resilience, because they will develop a skill to call on the supportive feelings that they need within themselves. And it's a good invitation, because she already feels that from you. So that will be a very easy transition if she goes to go find a practice group and practice this.
Beautiful.
I wanted to share too, I'm sure that everyone probably has already used this resource before. I'm throwing in the chat Brene Brown's Empathy versus Sympathy, because that's a great place to start when you're a little worried. But I would also just love to remind every single person here that all you have to do is look in front of you, not beyond. We are not solving the past, we are not solving the future. It's not a solving situation or not providing answers. We're in many times, no matter how much clinical training you have, just holding space, just seeing the person, just appreciating that they have shared something with you and letting them know that you appreciate that and that you're continually available for them to share things with you. We get so scared about practicing with that beyond like our competency range, and being a person is a competency range that we all have. Being empathetic, listening, holding space, and that's, like Eva shared so much in their stories, the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. There's one last question here, and I'm going to extrapolate a little bit from it. It's about someone looking for good exploratory questions when interviewing victims of potential labor trafficking, compared to being, it seems like, really comfortable and familiar with identifying sex trafficking, looking for an opportunity to improve screening and interviewing questions. And I want to tie it back to really directly the topic of today, because the thing that comes up for me when I see that question is about the number of people who've experienced labor trafficking who present at a service agency with another need or with another label, right? So they might come to you and they're seeking services as a sex trafficking victim, or as a victim of gender-based violence, or as someone who's looking for housing support, and they don't come in the door waving their hands, you know, screaming, "I'm a labor trafficking victim. I have a name for this and I know exactly what I need and I can tell you how to help me." How would you help identify those experiences for them in order to help them heal from the labor specific exploitation? It's kind of a big question to end on.
Just real quick, I did share to our past event on screening and interviewing, and that event itself has 3 videos of just organic screening mechanisms that you can use. Those individual videos will also be on our resource library, probably in like 2 months, but we're going to have them in English and Spanish.
Thanks, Charlee, for that plug.
I put together a handout for today's presentation, and one of the resources I listed is training CE course, and they have good answers to this. And if you don't need to see, you still be able to look through the contents, surprisingly. So I would encourage you to read through the material that they have there.
So we will follow up with that. Charlee already put the screening and interviewing event recording. So that's a really great resource. It's a good question because it gets to the heart of just the importance of helping a person identify those experiences. And so even just asking that question means you're on the right track. Tanisha, if I can.
I just want to share real quick that one of the first times that I ever was like, is this labor trafficking? It was a rape crisis situation, and I paused. I was like, I feel like I need a little bit more like insight from someone outside the room right now. I'm gonna get you a water, and I will be back in 2 minutes. And I honestly did. I went and I was like, how do I screen for labor trafficking? I don't remember. And it worked out. And that individual continued to utilize services at our agency for, I don't know, a year at least.
Well, I wish we could continue this conversation all day because I know there's so much more that we could dig into on this topic. It's so important. I want to thank you both for your time and your expertise today. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Eva and Charlee. And also, I encourage you to sign up for our upcoming event on financial literacy. It's the next in our series on labor trafficking service delivery. And you can check out all of our existing resources at our resource library, frameworkta.org. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.